Okay, we are live. Welcome everyone. Salam, peace to you all. I'm Adnan Husain. Welcome to the channel and to the second edition of Office Hours with Professor Adnan Husain. That's me, as I said. We had a great conversation last Friday, something that we'll try and do regularly. There was a lot of great feedback and good comments and questions and discussion in the chat. But we have a very important topic to be discussing today. So for office hours, given the state of the situation in Gaza, the starvation, the engineered famine and siege of Gaza, and the fact that this week we released the 8th part and update in the Palestine and the World History in a Time of Genocide Denial series that I've been doing with Professor Ariel Salzman from Queen's University, who is a friend and colleague who has been the sort of source as the expert in-house historian for this series of reframing from the Crusades to the present. We had the 8th part released earlier this week, which was an update since the time of recording of episode or part 7, which had been December 2024. We hadn't had an update. And of course, as you all know and understand all too well, the genocide has been continuing. There have been many things that have happened over the course of the last 8 months, and we covered some of them and gave some analysis in that episode. So do go ahead and check that out. But because it's been a series for 7, 8 episodes, there's a lot of material. We thought it would be great to have an opportunity to have your questions, your comments, and to also have a discussion, not just about the past, but about where we are right now and also where we need to go. And so as my guest on Office Hours, I have invited Dr. Ariel Salzman to join me yet again for a discussion here. Ariel, it's so great to have you back on.
Oh, thank you, Adnan. I welcome the audience and thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. And I feel, it's something I can do at this moment in history to actually help rethink the way we think about Palestine in the past and then in the present. And I think what part of our discussion should be is, what do we do now? And we know now every 12 minutes, according to some agencies, a Israeli drone or Israeli bomb are strafing and killing a Palestinian in Gaza. We know that practically every hour a child is dying. We know that the US and Israel together have set up traps. They're not even locations in distributing food. They pretend to be humanitarian, but they're actually death traps that are luring starving people to them and killing them as they try to access some meager rations. So we're really in this moment of, people have talked about it, the final solution, but it's worse than worse. And also we're on the precipice of yet another escalation in this massive violation of human rights, of international law, as Israel prepares to what they say is occupy Gaza City, which will inflict, of course, untold harm and will basically turn Gaza City into an urban, a 1 million population prison camp with the Israeli army as their prison guards.
Yes, I mean, that's really what we're on the precipice of in terms of up to the minute kinds of developments. As people who've been paying attention, watching the news, would be aware that there has been a diplomatic effort of sorts. There was the New York Declaration based on an overture and a plan and proposal put forward by France about its possible and conditional recognition of the state of Palestine in the upcoming UN session. And so it was accompanied by a number of other European and Western countries who also indicated that they would be willing to do that. The UK, Canada all made these sorts of statements. Of course, the United States condemned these and even threatened tariffs against Canada for participating in this kind of diplomatic effort. But it's in the context of that where already, and we should definitely talk a little bit about, what was at stake and what was involved and the different ways we could analyze and understand these overtures, including the New York Declaration, which was sponsored by Saudi, Egypt, and Qatar last week. That it's in the context of that, which we would have many critiques of the way in which the issue is being framed. That Israel has announced that it has much more ambitious plans of widening its kind of war in Gaza in order to introduce and occupy and reintroduce settlements, at least in the north of Gaza. So, this was something that was announced earlier this week, or it was reported on earlier this week. And at the UN, there have already been statements made by many countries and UN officials condemning the taking of this step. Here they've been working on trying to mobilize some kind of plan, for the upcoming session at the UN, and these are being completely torn apart. So that's
it's a window. Basically, I mean, this is the wrong calculus of the July 30th statement by Canada, France, and England. Is basically they gave Israel a window of operation until September 9th. They didn't say they were going to support recognize the state of Palestine today. They said, September 9th, we'll consider it, basically. And so, in terms of the political calculus, it was totally flawed. I mean, except for the fact that Canada, France, and England can somehow walk away and say, well, we're not complicit. But, it's actually, on the one hand, it presents some opportunity for demonstrations, for mobilizing on issues, ostensibly not a green light, a pale green light, to move on questions of divestment, of ending, the transfer of weapons, etc. And there's huge pushback here in Canada, as you know, and as well as in the United States against this statement in Canada. CJA and these other organizations have come out full-throated opposition to Carney. But the backfiring is, on the one hand, Trump has just given Netanyahu the go-ahead to do whatever they want. The Knesset is out of session, so there won't even be a debate. And Netanyahu has even replaced the generals who were, or who were war criminals to begin with new ones who are even more compliant to his wishes, because, basically Netanyahu's plan is perpetual war. Yes. So he'll never be out of power.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point there, because institutionally, it's a perfect time and opportunity to take advantage of the fact that there won't even be whatever muted political opposition. And I mean, the real point is that there are stresses and strains, and we've seen news reports. It's not always clear how exactly to take them and to, put them in context, but there were news reports fairly recently, maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, about how some of the members of this kind of council, it's sort of advisory council of ex-generals and intelligence chiefs and, basically people who are involved in the military and security and intelligence apparatus of Israel, had been, lobbying and begging Trump. I don't know in what venues, but they were making, overtures to the US government to save them from, and to save Israel from, basically the plans and policies of this perpetual war, because it is putting such an immense strain on the military, on the intelligence apparatus, on the society, on the economy. And, there are fears that, these institutions could collapse and fall apart if they have to commit to the plans, the egomaniacal, far right extremist plans for really embedding them into a full-scale occupation, attempted reoccupation, of Gaza. So I think there are strains and there are stresses, but it seems like those voices don't have, a place to mobilize, even within, at least Israeli politics, because they're not in session. So it's going to be interesting to see, what happens. I mean, we're right on the cusp of it. This is something that was announced just days ago, and it could happen at any moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, and the split, I think, for these generals and, former partners in the government with Netanyahu who have since departed, or Ehud Olmert, who's, come out and, decrying the pariahization of Israel because of the horrors that are going on in Gaza. There is a fundamental split within Israel. Those people who are serving in the military are largely non-religious Jews, and they're certainly not part of those groups who compose the settlers. So basically, the settlers are becoming this kind of shock troop. They're not only the tail that wags the dog within the Israeli politic, the West Bank settlements, but they're now going to be a kind of shock troop because they're heavily armed, and they've been waiting for 20 years since Ariel Sharon decided to basically pull out and enclose Gaza, right? That the costs were too high. Now I think what's going to happen to Israel at the end of this. I mean, there are people who say collapse, Mearsheimer, various other people, say, but I think there's a massive split, a widening split. And of course, it does nothing to further Palestinian rights. It does nothing to end this apocalypse, this Holocaust that's going on. I mean, we have never in history, this is an unprecedented moment, live stream 22 months of genocide, live streaming. We know what's going on there. I mean, having relatives who came to the States after the Holocaust, we didn't know, Jews in North America didn't know the full extent of what was going on until after the war. Now, there is no excuse for everyday people, and of course for Western governments who signed on in December 1948 to the Genocide Convention. There's absolutely no excuse for their lack of movement especially since December 2024. They are now fully complicit. And of course, as Francesca Albanese has shown, it's a global military supply chain, and includes Korea, and includes Colombian coal, and it goes all the way around the world, and it gets filtered into Israel's occupation, Israel's destruction, Israel's plundering of Palestinian resources. In fact, today there was just an article, Haaretz, how soldiers are stealing children's piggy banks in the West Bank as they raze their homes and their villages. And this plunder goes on, of course, in Gaza as well. It's been well documented.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you mentioned the global supply chain, that is, of course, because the global economy, while it does have some regional concentrations, has become obviously much more globalized, and that's probably even more the case for the global arms kind of trade and the components and the supplies and things that are needed. I mean, and it's also very much a feature, of course, of the state of Israel itself. It is this enclave that for decades had no trade and diplomatic relations with its actual neighbors, and was a implanted kind of colony of the West as a whole that had to be supported and connected to the West. And likewise, it has continued, even though there have been some agreements and collaboration and cooperation, like, for example, to circumvent the Ansar Allah blockade in the Red Sea of creating a kind of overland from the Persian Gulf, through these Gulf states on the coast there, and overland, kind of trade corridor to connect it to trade coming from the Far East and Indian Ocean. And there was, of course, recently a report, I think it might have even been in The Economist, I'm not sure, I can't remember, where there was an accounting of Israel's biggest trading partners. And of course, China is the number one trading partner with Israel, both ways, I think, in terms of supplying goods and commodities and so forth to Israel, but also it's one of its big buyers and purchasers. So there is, of course, that component. But let's recall that Gustavo Petro is one of the very few leaders of Global South country that has made a principled stand, hosted the Hague group, the 32 nations that were invited. I mean, it originally, of course, was an initiative of a handful of countries that started in January of 2025, but they held their first big kind of conference and invited other countries that came, that included China and Turkey and some others from outside the original group. 12 of those 32 at the meeting, maybe 4 weeks ago in Bogota, actually adopted a set of sanctions of, trade embargo, military embargo. And Gustavo Petro has cut off coal supply of Israel, which caused something of an energy crisis. They've had to scramble to find other energy resources, and of course, one of which is, further exploiting natural gas and other fossil fuel, resources off the coast in the Mediterranean. And we just noticed that, the day before yesterday, I think it was, that a $35 billion trade deal with Egypt to supply it from those very fields, was signed. And so there is a continuing kind of support through trade for Israel, despite a lot of rhetoric, a lot of condemnation, about the latest situation in Gaza and the starvation, the need for, more aid and relief to come through to help the Palestinians. But there is this global network of trade. I think, of course, the vast majority of it, however, is still the support and trade and aid that flows to Israel from, the United States. Germany is the second biggest military supplier.
Italy.
And Italy, actually, surprisingly, you never hear really that much about Italy.
Italy has a big military.
So, I mean, I think that's where we have to kind of really, for us, if we're thinking about what we can do, and we have this kind of question from Ware Pilgrim, who says, given the reporting on the complicity of nations like Canada and the UK about how they're supporting the genocide via obfuscated assistance and arms sales, do you think the pressure on them will escalate? This, of course, is coming out after, I think he's referring to Canada and the UK specifically, because there were two recent news reports and a report. In fact, one was the from the Canada, the exact title is the Canada arms embargo. They have the Stop the Canada Arms Now website, and they had a report that they just published very recently called Exposing Canadian Military Exports to Israel, that came out July 29th. So just a couple of weeks ago.
The day before the proclamation, right?
That's right. And it gave the lie to claims by Canadian officials on the record, particularly then Foreign Minister Melanie Joly and Mark Carney, Prime Minister Mark Carney, that they were abiding by a decision not to supply weapons. And this report documents in great detail how that is completely false. It was so explosive in some sense in exposing the lies of Canadian officials on the record that it elicited a response from current Foreign Minister Anita Anand, who said, oh, this is false information. It's really exaggerating and they don't understand exactly, and tried to claim that they were just sending paintballs for training and various other things, to try and obfuscate the complicity of the Canadian government. But the report really documents from using news sources, which included Israeli tax records, for like import customs tax records, and coordinating it with other shipping information, because of course the information about the licenses that have to be approved, that had been, claimed that they were no longer offering export licenses for Canadian produced arms and military components, were being circumvented, and they're using these loopholes of selling things to the United States for reshipment, right? So that makes it difficult to track, but using these other sources and other methods of trying to kind of see where things are moving and other records, they've been able to document and trace very substantial continuing Canadian complicity. And the other report, of course, is, coming from, there was a recent Times report that was following up on the, outstanding work of a journalist who just appeared on the Electronic Intifada. I follow him on Twitter. I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. I tweeted about how wonderful his investigative work was. He used to work for Declassified UK, but he's now, an independent kind of journalist. And he just was a guest because earlier this week, they were able to determine and track, using these kind of tracking air flight tracking software, that a new company, a plane registered to a private US company, took off from RAF Akrotiri's base on Cyprus. And neglected to turn off its transponder, because normally they've been showing them come close to, the shoreline of Gaza, and then they turned off their transponders and you couldn't track to see where exactly they flew over for these surveillance flights over Gaza, and what time they were in what location, in order to be able to coordinate whether intelligence was shared for targeting of Israeli attacks. And the UK, when asked by the very few people who've actually been investigating this, asked about these flights, they said, oh, this was just for, surveillance and intelligence gathering to find the location of the hostages, but it wasn't being shared with the Israeli military. That has all fallen apart, because it's been admitted by an anonymous military source who said that they were horrified that with these images of starvation going on, that not only were they continuing these flights, but they had decided to hire an American company now to do them for them. Luckily, the well-trained RAF, always managed to disguise where they were. This time, the first flight of this private military contractor doing these surveillance flights forgot to turn off the transponder, and it was possible to track that they did indeed go over Gaza, over flights. And there was an attack, a target on a place in Khan Yunis that happened right after, and that apparently these aircraft have live sharing ability. So there's no way to, have a barrier to say, well, we gathered the intelligence through our surveillance flights, then we digested, and only the things that were, to share about location with the, so-called hostages, the prisoners of war. Let's remember that those who are still there in Gaza are military personnel, and that those then were shared. No, it's live, surveillance that can be used by the Israeli military for targeting, and in fact, it appears that it has, and that is going to be explosive in any future war crimes prosecution for complicity, because you have David Lammy being asked about this just a couple of days ago and saying, no, we would never share any information that led to targeting and attacks upon civilians. We just wouldn't do it. Well, that is all lies. And so the question here from Where Pilgrim is, well, is there going to be more political pressure as a result of these lies and the fictions that they've been using to avoid direct complicity? These are falling apart directly. What's going to happen? So that's, I think, an important and interesting question.
Well, I think, in Canada, there has been success using Canadian courts, for example, to strip strip organizations, so-called charitable organizations, of their charity status because they're basically subventing illegal settlements on the West Bank, etc., or putting money directly into, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And I think this is also where, these very useful reports that are coming out have to be used very quickly to press forward in this window that we have before September 9th, press forward with divestment and insist that this is, Canada has now issued an ultimatum to Israel, and it has to back it up. And they can no longer do business as usual, and they have to go one step further, because otherwise their words have absolutely no meaning. In fact, they're just a license to do further damage before the 9th of September, because then it's going to be very explosive in the General Assembly.
Well, that's right. And as we've been saying, and we did say on, I've said on a couple of the struggle session panels that we've had before, and on our update 8, of Palestine and the World, the 8th part that just came out a couple of days ago. People should go check it out. The title of which was "No, There Is No Post Gaza." Okay, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that. But on that, we said it is basically a race right now. It's a race between forces that want to resist on the ground in Gaza, to survive, to continue to do damage, to kind of continue their armed resistance, and the forces that are in solidarity attempting to put political pressure to end this genocide. It's a race between those forces and how quickly and how completely Israel, that has been granted so much impunity. I think that's the other way to kind of examine that. While there may be some, kind of consensus emerging in Europe and certainly the global South, excluding the United States, that there needs to be some kind of peace program and a ceasefire and so on, the terms and conditions of which I think, are totally unrealistic and inappropriate. But the point is that there's some emerging disquiet about, what's happening, that there's been so much impunity up to this point. And the fact that the United States, as you pointed out, Trump has decided not to bother with appearing, weak with these red lines. And he doesn't want to be embarrassed by clearly a rogue, kind of like actor like Netanyahu. He doesn't want to be embarrassed by him. So he's just said openly, finish the job. And as a result, that's what we're seeing, is Israel is working to try and finish the job, as it were, to make the facts on the ground, allow them to evade any kind of restraint and condemnation. I mean, they're happy to take the condemnation, but what they want is to achieve their goals. And the only question really is can the people, as what Abu Ubaidah called in his appeal in one of his more recent videos, the free peoples of the world, whether the free peoples of the world can stop it, or whether, the armed resistance can hold out and successfully, manage to stymie attempts to try and, which they have managed up to this point. It's impossible to protect the Palestinian people, but it has not been possible for the Israeli military to completely achieve its, goals and objectives of wiping out Hamas and controlling the territory without any resistance, for which they've been having to pay a high price. So that's kind of the question.
Well,
and you've pointed out September 9th.
But the impunity of Israel is wearing the impunity of the West.
Yeah, exactly.
And the impunity of the West is on the line. The impunity of the West vis-a-vis international law, the impunity of the West, even by their own rules, their own rule-based order, that they can break it. They are the exception to the rule, and the rule is the West has total impunity, and Israel is of the West and is a function of the West, and everything it's doing there is in complete, ultimately, with a complete acquiescence and support of the West. And so these statements, I think we have to move on them and use them. But, as you said, resistance, at home and wherever in Palestine. It can be mounted. But the other thing is accountability. We have to put these governments on notice that there will be a price to pay.
Yes.
And, these companies, that the Genocide Convention will be invoked, that there will be a tribunal, and they will sit on the dock alongside the Israelis, as co-conspirators in this genocide, unprecedented, sadistic display of asymmetrical force, at a magnitude that has never been seen before. Of
Right.
completely, largely unarmed civilian population being bombarded, I think, by the seventh most powerful army in the world, supplied by the first most powerful army in the world, in this tiny, tiny enclave the size of Ottawa, of Greater Ottawa. So, accountability, I think we have to start planning now, is how we are going to hold these countries accountable. Their weakness, we have to point out their cowardice, their utter cowardice. They can't stand up. They won't stand up to the United States either. I mean, this is part of the other problem, right? So it's not like they're jumping out really ahead of Trump. Actually, they're the good cop. Trump is the bad cop. So but we have to make them know that they will be held accountable. The politicians will be held accountable, who have gone along with this, and the governments.
Yes, yes. And to that end, I thought this would be a useful topic for us to have, is discussing some of the ways in which a politics and an organization around accountability is important, not only for the future, where we hope that there will be war crimes prosecutions for those who are involved, complicit and inciters of war crimes, but also to demonstrate in this moment right now, as part of the political pressure that can be brought to bear, in addition to things like demonstrating in the streets and the other things that we've been doing, but that this is in fact actually part of what could be brought to bear right now in this particular moment, on the cusp of major decisions, in the face of the threats of a widening, plan of military warfare, in Gaza. Now is the time to try and leverage every possible thing that can be. So I actually drew up a list of kinds of institutions and different areas and arenas in which the politics of organizing accountability could be potentially effective. Now, one thing you mentioned, Ariel, is a tribunal. Well, before you can have the actual ICC, International Criminal Court, or something like the International Court of Justice holding kind of tribunals in an official legal process, you can nonetheless have people's tribunals. And this is something that, in fact, actually just recently took place, is that there was the tribunal, and I believe international lawyer Craig Mohiber reported on it, in the Sarajevo declaration that they made. The Gaza Tribunal is like the other Bernard Russell People's Tribunal that goes back to Vietnam War and so on, and was done for other genocides and for other situations like this. Well, the Gaza Tribunal exists. It's already established itself. It's begun collecting, information and testimony, and they held their very first kind of meeting in Sarajevo just like last couple of months ago, in June, I believe. And they put out the Sarajevo Declaration, and people should go out and look at that, because these are the kinds of processes we need to be investing in now, because they will make the transition from people's tribunal into legal process under international law much easier, and will actually make, create a groundswell of, pressure to actually have that when it happens, and announces now that people are watching, and that there is evidence that's being assembled that can be used, right now. So I don't know if you had any thoughts, if you've heard about the Gaza Tribunal, but it's something you mentioned about.
Yeah, no. I think it's really, really important. But there's also the Hind Rajab Foundation
Yes, well,
in
that's other,
Belgium,
yes.
which is assembling dossiers on Israeli soldiers who posted on TikTok their crimes against humanity, their crimes of war. And so there will be individual prosecutions. They'll be banning people from moving, from leaving Israel and coming there to countries in the European Union, using European Union law to do that. And I think there's also going to be a reckoning, and I speak as an American Jew who grew up largely in the United States, who grew up in a very Zionist household. There's going to be a reckoning within Judaism too. And people like Peter Beinart are some. They're religious Jews, non-religious Jews, independent Jewish voices, of course, here, Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States, and very importantly also, if not now, those groups. And I think they're going to put tremendous pressure. Reform Judaism is the largest branch of Judaism in the United States, and they have been silent. They have been silent. It is just deafening. Despite their, commitments all through the years, including to civil rights and everything else. But there is going to be a tremendous reckoning because at this point, many Jewish communities are sort of in their little bubbles and isolated from the horrors, which is, I think, another driving force in what Netanyahu has been doing all along. Kill the messengers, kill the journalists. No eyes, poke out the eyes of the world. And that's also why he wants to occupy. In fact, it's almost inevitable that he occupies Gaza so that he can keep out the human rights organizations and that there cannot be a documented record that is official. And there can't be, even CNN reporters have been demanding to get access to Gaza. And it's, and there's actually a court case going on now with the Israeli Supreme Court why all journalists have been banned from Gaza, except maybe TRT World stringers who've been working for, Al Jazeera, exactly, and Turkish. But the rest of them are all citizen reporters, and they've all been, they have been targeted, more ferociously or as ferociously as any militant group.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there has been like Al Jazeera reporters and others, but they're all Gazans working on the ground from within Gaza. There has been very little kind of access from outside. I have to say, I know that of course that's been Israel's military policy to try and prevent, the pictures of the world going out on mainstream media and mainstream news sources. I do have to say I am a little disappointed, however, in the journalists of the world. I think in previous conflicts, there has been a little bit more determination to get the story out, to get in there, to demand access. And there's been a real compliance and acquiescence with, Israeli military policy and just sort of following along with that.
They've been embedded, just like
they've been, because there were cases where there were some early pictures, of course, just documenting, some of the kibbutzim in the Gaza corridor, Gaza envelope, soon after October 7th, where they could take people and, curate a certain kind of images and story that wanted to be sold about, what had happened and to build, a kind of consensus for the military assault upon Gaza and the genocidal scope of it. But there's been precious little really of the kind of bravery. I mean, really the bravery has been, as you said, these citizen journalists who have fought to get the story out on the channels that are available to them heroically. But as you said, this is the first time in history. Everyone always is remarking upon the fact that this is the first time that we have a live stream genocide. Being shown to us through social media. It
wasn't like, within 3 months or 2 months. We're talking about 2 years. It's October 7th. We're already at 22 months.
22 months.
And
that raises
starvation since March, right?
Yes.
Before that, just a trickle of aid coming in, and now none whatsoever. So what we 4, 5, 6 months. But the other thing that I think really has to, we have to be prepared to do is move on the offensive. Take
Yes.
these new documents and say, okay, put your money where your mouth is. This has got to happen. Enough with your, cowardly words, and qualifications. If you want to end the genocide, if you want to escape culpability, you have to do this. On the other side, the pro-Israel groups, the Israel can do no wrong ever groups are mobilizing massively. And we have to go on a defensive as well to recognize that they are going to be moving ever more heavily. I mean, this is the classic Israel MO. After every atrocity, their Hasbara just amps up. And they're going to be moving on every level. Of course, one of their main instruments is to target and tar any person who speaks ill of Israel or defends Palestinian rights as being anti-Semitic. So we can expect that this is something that's going to be escalating right now. They've gotten a lot of traction, of course, in the United States. And they've effectively censored a lot of the media, and of course, they're censoring all the universities there. Germany has already used the anti-Semitism card to silence people, to prevent people from coming in. But there's going to be a massive push now. And I think we have to be prepared for it and know how we're going to deal with it.
That's a great point, because you're right that has been a pattern, that far from kind of being put on the defensive and apologetic when evidence of extreme atrocities happen, when does anyone recall the time when the Shifa hospital was hit by a missile and it became a massive news story, but they were completely prepared to say, oh, it was a errant Hamas missile, oh, there was a Hamas command center. They were ready to go on the offensive and say, how dare you criticize us for targeting patients in a hospital when we have to, kind of defend ourselves. So you're absolutely right and we have, that's in the mists of time now. That's in the archive, that the outrage that was quickly dispelled, reoriented, and now we've become so used to atrocity after atrocity that we've also seen the escalation of the Hasbara propaganda and rhetoric becoming so insanely self-confident, that you can expect, of course, that once the pictures come out of mass starvation actually happening, and not just the most weak and the most vulnerable. It's just been so disgusting how they've been talking about it to try and deny. I mean, Netanyahu says there's no starvation. In fact, there's plenty of food. No, it's Hamas who took it. If there is, it's like, well, what's the story here? Either there is starvation, and you're responsible for it, or you're denying it, but then you're saying, oh well, but it's because Hamas has taken it, etc. There is absolutely, I think, no credibility left, but yet it does manage to sow seeds of confusion, and we have to be, I think, two things. One, absolutely determined not to fall for any of this stuff, and not to be cowed by, as you're saying, these charges that are weaponizing charges of anti-Semitism in a very sort of flagrant way, to cow people and to prevent them from putting political pressure to stop this genocide, and to not be disunited in our goals. The goal is not, for example, I really think this whole reviving the two-state solution and Oslo, it's like zombified Oslo. Nobody should be fooled by this. Oslo was a process by which the occupation, advanced and progressed, and did so with the world asleep or approving it, because it was part of this peace process that was an endless process of colonization, of occupation being extended, and where appropriate in Palestinian urban areas, subcontracting the occupation to a comprador, Palestinian authority. So this attempt to revive it is a real red herring. However, a lot of people are going to think that there is an opening and all of that. But if you look at the actual details, the 41, I think there were 41 provisions in the declaration that France and Saudi made in the New York Declaration. And if you look at these are all about basically accomplishing the goals of the occupation without Israel actually having to do the dirty work of defeating Hamas. It's like, well, let's find a way in which we can convince the world to intervene and basically make some kind of aid that may be too little, too late by the time this process actually begins, will be distributed after we have managed to oversee the disarming, and of the resistance and handing the subcontracting of the policing of Palestinians and the suppression of their political rights by, a corrupt comprador class. So that's, I think, very important. There's going to be a lot of pushback. There's going to be, kind of cul-de-sacs of these kind of peace processes and so on. But what we have to stay, I think, absolutely focused on is ending the genocide. I mean, that's what really has to happen.
And calling these leaders out as cowards, as moral cowards, and that this whole statement and all those qualifications speaks of their cowardice and their inability to come forward and talk with moral clarity about this absolutely unprecedented situation that's happening before our eyes. This accountability for our leaders, but also, recognizing right now, very clear-eyed, that Israel has this window of, that they're hoping to accomplish their goals in this month. So, while, the universities are out of session, the Knesset's out of session, the US Congress will probably be out of session, the Canadian Parliament and all these others, they're going to be pushing. And they're not just in Gaza. It's going to be, they've already unleashed the settlers on the West Bank. They're killing people with impunity. They're destroying whole entire villages. They're preventing them from return. Of course, they're taking their fields. They're killing their animals, cutting down their olive trees. So this is, we have to be super focused on what is unfolding right now. In Palestine, and call our leaders out for basically enabling it by giving them this month-long, license. You have a license until September 9th, and then we'll talk about it.
That's right. Like, why can't they call for an emergency meeting of the Security Council? There could be a Chapter 7 humanitarian corridor by the Security Council established. They could easily do, once the General Assembly is in session, then ratify and legalize that with a Uniting for Peace motion. I mean, these resolutions and these, provisions do exist, but what's lacking right now is clearly the will and the political pressure. They're being given, as you said, an opportunity before the September 9th kind of reconvening of the General Assembly of the UN. When everyone starts paying attention again, they're using this opportunity, and they've been given the go-ahead, the green light from Trump that there will be impunity, and they want to try. And as I said, we were saying it's a race. Can they do it as quickly as possible? That's what we're having to kind of really deal with. And we need to find a way to ratchet up the pressure. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other techniques. But before going on to some of those, I just want to acknowledge people in the chat. There's been a great lively discussion. I'm trying to put up some of your comments and so on and get to some of your questions. But it's great to see some returnees from the first office hours. You guys are repeat offenders, Ode to John Trudell, Ware Pilgrim. It's great to see Resistance is Fertile, colleague Benji from that great podcast, and a bunch of others who are in the chat. Alex has joined. Pink Rose, it's good to see you. And I see that there are also, I do want to remind you, right now, you should like the stream. It'll get more before more people's eyes if you like this live stream now, so that other people who don't receive it on their feeds on YouTube might be notified and can come on and join this very important and I hope beneficial discussion, that we're having here with you in the chat and with us on the panel with Dr. Ariel Salzman, who is a historian of the modern Middle East and Ottoman and early modern Mediterranean and world historian, who was the kind of key expert in our series that we did together, Palestine and the World, History in a Time of Genocide. There's been 8 episodes. First 7 were released a while ago. We did an 8th as an update to catch you up on analysis on the events that took place since December 2024 to the present day. That's out earlier this week. It's on my YouTube channel, on this channel as a playlist. You can watch all of them. But in the meantime, like this stream, share the video on your social media so people know that it's happening, and subscribe to the channel so you get notifications in the future. I want to also welcome that East is a podcast. Viewers on that channel are also sharing on this stream. I really would like some of you to come over and watch on this stream so that we can build this channel. We're doing a lot of great things. Many of which have been with Dr. Ariel Salzman, and we're very lucky to have her for a couple of hours today to answer your questions, to engage in this discussion. So with that out of the way, let's come back to some of the kind of questions. There was a question, in fact, actually, that had come in the chat, which was about a recent meeting. I think it was a question from Alex. I see that the presidents of Azerbaijan and Armenia met with Trump today. What can we make of this? Of course, we're thinking of, Armenia has been very much a kind of Russian and Iranian kind of ally, and Azerbaijan has been very much in the orbit of Turkey and a very pro-Israel power, and has caused, all kinds of problems for Iran. There's a lot of tensions with them. As we know, of course, there's been disputed area, Nagorno-Karabakh, this kind of area that's claimed by both their Armenian, an enclave of an Armenian majority population in what was part of the state of Azerbaijan. Another case of these stranded populations, as it were, when you have cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires breaking up. But so, Ariel, maybe you can give us further kind of background and analysis. What do you think this portends, since they fought some wars?
I think every state in the world is bending the knee to Trump at this point, and Trump is operating a shakedown operation. He's using the tariffs. He's using the threat of tariffs. He's using the threat of U.S. weapons and support. He's using Israel's violence as an example, as an extension, which it is, of U.S. power. So he's just welcoming all these states, and his kids are lined up saying, we want a Trump Tower in Baku, something else in Yerevan. And so, all these states are having to come to kiss the ring. And he's using it as a private shakedown operation.
Yeah.
And pretending, of course, that he has some leverage on, other powers in the region. After all, this is the Caucasus. This is Russia's backyard, too. So, that's what's also going on here.
Yes.
The farcical notion that he's aiming for a Nobel Peace Prize,
Well, you have Pakistan nominating him. I think that was like a kind of proactive move. I don't think he played any substantive role. I think what played a role was China's JC-10s and targeting systems and downing several several Indian jets, and some clear heads, because these are two nuclear powers finally, kind of agreeing that maybe this shouldn't escalate beyond that. But I think Pakistan thought, hey, this is a way to kind of improve our relations with the United States. Let's nominate Trump.
They're dealing with an egomaniac, so you know how to do
it. That's smart diplomacy on their part.
The smartest is, of course, Mexico. So she's used to dealing with machismo and in her parties and stuff like that. You stroke him. Now, we just had a question about the arms. Germany just today announced that it was ceasing offensive weapon sales to Israel. Pink Rose is asking. That's right. Of course, that doesn't mean very much because, what is offensive and what is defensive in Israel's arsenal, we don't know. And of the many weapons and component parts that Germany continues to send, again, these are symbolic gestures. These are just these bespeak of the utter cowardice and moral bankruptcy of these Western states. That they're unable to stand up to the United States. I mean, the EU is unable to stand up to the United States. Individual states, have gone, much further. But Germany is the heart, the economic center of, and it controls, all the peripheries now, with England, except for France, of course. But with all these sort of, it's the economic hub that's holding the EU together. So, but none of these countries are willing to stand up or even stand together, really, to do something serious and effective. And that's the whole point, listing all those conditions, in the announcement with France, Canada, and England. In addition to, of course, reviving the zombie state, the zombie idea of
The Oslo.
the Oslo Accord. There's no Palestine left. Israel has gobbled up the West Bank, and it's already mobilizing its settler troops, its settler colonialists, to take over, much of Gaza. Again, leaving, maybe Gaza City, after they kill half the population,
And Rafah.
and Rafah, and to Jordan and Qatar,
Yes.
or Jordan, Egypt, and Qatar, to police.
Yes.
And so, I mean, Palestine is a diaspora too. And I think the diaspora, we have to start talking about how the diaspora is, organizing, sustaining Palestine, and what is going to happen, in the aftermath of, this current slaughter. But the diaspora has, so that is for the diaspora to start reimagining what Palestine can be.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting topic. I remember Ilan Pappé saying something a little bit like that, but it was less about exclusively the diaspora. It was a little bit about how, a different kind of political imagination is going to be needed to get beyond this and include the diaspora. But as you're pointing out, if Palestine is devastated, as we're seeing, with Gaza becoming uninhabitable through both bombardment and the destruction of civilian infrastructure, the very means of existence and life, and the suffocating siege that has, undermined its ability to, do anything. There's no economy left whatsoever because there's no productive activities you can conduct under these conditions. You can't get any of the resources. The agricultural land has been, destroyed. The herds have been destroyed. I mean, a lot of Gaza was actually farmland, and, they had to do quite a lot of subsistence kind of farming for Gaza. They still had to import aid, and they needed all these, trucks coming, to provide some of the necessities. But there were farms, there were herds. They attempted to use the land to the extent that they could for productive use for their survival, outside of the dense, kind of concentrations of population in Gaza City, Rafah, Khan Yunis. But in these other areas, those are being, and have been destroyed. And it's the same kind of thing, of course, we're seeing, on a slower scale with less devastation, but the very same kind of process taking place in the West Bank, as you were pointing out, olive groves being, taken over, burned, uprooted, herds being, destroyed, shot, or taken. And so, this is, of course, a terrible moment. But I mean, Pink Rose, we were talking a little bit about some of the inability of these states to band together. You're pointing out that no state seems willing to confront Trump, and that they would rather make a bargain, like, and let him declare some victories and grease the palms, pay a bribe, like when he went to the Gulf, came back with what, 7 billion or something, and kind of
and
commitment.
a plane,
yeah, right, gifts, all this kind of stuff. So he's being mollified, in this way. But there was the Hague Group, so this is the kind of question. I mean, but what I found so disappointing, like Pink Rose is saying here, is that, even some of the countries that attended the Bogota meeting of the Hague Group recently, 12 of whom, and I think subsequently Turkey announced that it would abide by the provisions of the other 12 that had been part of the declaration from Bogota of sanctions on trade and various things. We'll see whether that amounts to anything. But some of the countries that actually attended that endorsed the France proposal, like Ireland, Norway. I mean, so what it shows is that there is possibly a moral revulsion to the scale of the genocide that are forcing some, kind of countries where there's been political pressure and the people have expressed a conscience to, cause their governments to make some steps, to kind of participate in isolating Israel in some fashion, but that they all still adhere to a vision and an understanding of the situation politically that doesn't allow them to see that the peace process is a mirage, it is a chimera, and that you have to focus on the fundamental questions of ending the genocide and actually giving people sovereignty. Like, peace is not going to come from, negotiating out, the self-determination of the Palestinian people by handing, them a kind of comprador ruler and declaring it a kind of quasi-state. That's just not going to work.
In these little Bantustans that currently exist, right?
Yeah.
And there has to be also, I mean, before even, before the 90s, there had already been accounting, after 48 and after 67, there were actually economic accounting of what, the current value of the land. Say this is not just settlement. This is stolen land. This is an act of
expropriation,
pre-modern
dispossession.
plunder. It is just pure plunder.
It's primitive accumulation.
Well, and it has to be, the reparations, you have to put a dollar figure on it too, or to just exemplify how much has been stolen from the Palestinians in land, movable property, accountability for futures shortened. I mean, all of this has to be, assembled and made accountable for the Israeli state and their enablers. So
that's right. So we should maybe talk about some of the other mechanisms and techniques. You did mention the Hind Rajab Foundation, which is based in Belgium, which has been already, in fact, actually putting forward prosecutions for returning soldiers in Europe, from European countries who have violated their country's laws and international law by, participating, in the Israeli military during the genocide. So there have been, in fact, actually a couple of prosecutions or cases that they've put forward. And they divide, very interestingly, their cases into three categories: perpetrators, accomplices, and inciters. So they are interested also in documenting those who have inflamed and incited and encouraged, or through the media coverage, but especially statements made by politicians that have encouraged genocidal, barbaric acts and violations of international, law and war crimes. And so I think that's important, and people should check out their site and see ways in which they can participate in assisting and helping. And of course, you can donate to the Hind Rajab Foundation so that they can continue their work, pay their lawyers. I know there are many great people who are doing it for volunteers, but their staff and so on. So check out the Hind Rajab Foundation. So that's going to be for prosecutions within domestic, kind of jurisdictions of violations of law in particular countries, as well as international law. in the United States, since many of the people in this chat and the audience are in the US, they should familiarize themselves with the Leahy Law Accountability
Palestine
Project.
legal, Palestine legal, also,
That's,
defensive,
yeah, so
but
Leahy
not
Law
directly
Accountability.
concerned with Palestine or Israel, but also, I mean, I just want to shift that back for 1 second, because I talked about anti-Semitism, but I think it's also really important that we recognize that diasporas, Palestinian diasporas, are also under attack. That anti-Semitism, the charge of anti-Semitism, is a way to particularly silence them and their allies. So this is also a moment where, in tandem with that, I do think we have to move forward with getting city governments, universities, federal government, provincial government to recognize anti-Palestinian racism as something that's going on right now, both as a means, because that's also other arm of the Hasbara, is to make sure that that doesn't come up, because when it does come up, it recognizes Palestinian history, it recognizes what's going on right now, and these organizations are dead set against having that be recognized. So in tandem with the sort of offensive things, Hind Rajab, we have to go on the defensive to protect people's voices, protect Palestinian diaspora from being targeted with violence, with attacks, attacks on their character, and so I think that's what also has to happen in this moment.
The Ode to John Trudell was responding to your statement that you need to put a figure on it. I think what you were talking about is the actual economic value of the land, the resources that have been expropriated and stolen. I don't think you were talking about putting a price on human lives, but in terms of reparations for damage that's done in order to restore to Palestine the value of its land, water, resources, all the damage done to its crops and to, its flocks and so on. I think that's what you were talking about. So just to respond to that. But yes, okay, so you were talking a little bit about this other kind of dimension, which is on kind of responding to kind of the political suppression and the intimidation and the creation of a culture of impunity by weaponizing charges of anti-Semitism against those who express solidarity with and advocate for Palestine and the cause of Palestine. So that's a whole other arena, and we know that, and it's clear that the Trump administration and these kind of forces that are using these kinds of attempts to suppress political speech and education are doing so in ways that are destroying institutions like the university that are already, of course, hollowed out by the neoliberal academy, but whatever, life support the, kind of humanities and social sciences, have been on in the North American university or in the Western academy, they're being dealt death blows by the avenues of using, defunding a math institute at UCLA because the administration at UCLA allowed supposedly, pro-Palestine protests, or everything we've seen happening at Columbia University that has led a colleague of ours, Rashid Khalidi, to withdraw his course because having 1 week where he talked about the Palestinian national cause and history is not possible under the terms of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism that has been enforced as the official way of determining, what anti-Semitism is for the purposes principally of immunizing, the Israeli state from, criticism. that's affecting, as you said. I think it's impossible to teach the Middle East,
No, it's impossible to teach them.
under these conditions. You can't actually do an honest job of talking about the history, society, politics of the region, when you have this definition being imposed to determine what's allowable and what's not.
Yeah, and of course, it's a wonderful mask, because I think stepping right behind it is the white supremacist agenda, using the same thing. In Florida, you can't teach history of slavery, enslavement of Black people, because it makes white people feel uncomfortable.
That's right.
So it's this mask above. Well, we're very high-minded. We protect Jews, but right behind it is the censorious agenda to basically purge any kind of mention of the United States crimes, of crimes against humanity, and purge them from history, purge them from social sciences and everything. And in the process, this is so, sadly ironic for Jews, is to actually diminish the forces that have historically oppressed Jews and led to the Holocaust, and oppressed Jews for centuries in Western Europe, of course, in Western Christendom, which is Christianity itself, which is the accusation of deicide. No one even talks about it when they raise the international IHRA ad hoc definition, because they don't want to go there. I mean,
well,
it diverts the whole conversation.
No, they do go there. Marjorie Taylor Greene goes there to oppose the IHRA definition solely on the grounds that it prevents Christians from saying what actually happened, according to her. The theological, historical truth that the Jews killed Jesus. Hey, if you can't prevent me from saying that as a good Christian in a Christian nation, so her qualms and concerns were basically to authorize, and reinforce the historic anti-Semitism, as opposed to the so-called new anti-Semitism, which is basically criticism of, Israeli state policy, right? So she wants to preserve that. And so that's that's what's the irony of the situation in that respect. But I mean, I think you had already raised that there's going to have to be some kind of accounting. That's for people within the Jewish community to determine. You pointed out that there's been a lot of silence in even Reform Judaism, which isn't even recognized as a legitimate kind of denomination, as it were, within in Israel. But yet, there hasn't been that kind of accounting. I was on Revolutionary Blackout Network with Nick Cruz, and he had a panel with a couple of us, Nerdine Kaswani and Rob, I'm forgetting his name, but he's for Independent Jewish Voices, or Jewish Voices, JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, had been involved with them. And, he was talking about, because he's made these kind of statements that have got him into a little bit of trouble and criticism, even with allies on the left, because he said, where are the Jewish organizations? Why aren't they, coming out? And anti-Zionist Jews are themselves being oppressed and called self-hating Jews and isolated and marginalized, just as, Jamie Says What is saying. Here that
it's such an old hackneyed charge, and I have to say that it's been, at this point in time, it doesn't hold any water. There are so many organizations. There's so many new organizations. There's so many Jews who are disillusioned with what's going on. If you talk to people and you bring them to the side, maybe they don't join Independent Jewish Voices. They won't join Jewish Voices for Peace. They are very disturbed with what's going on, and they've confided in me. They know my position, and they confide in me and I think there's going to be a tremendous reckoning as the data is accumulated, as the case is presented fully, as every detail and the horror and the ghastliness and the sadism and the fanaticism of this Israeli government and what they've been doing all along is presented with them. And then I think there's going to be a real accounting within these Jewish organizations certainly in terms of the spectrum of the Jewish denominations, the Reconstructionists have been out in front. There's a whole bunch of Reconstructionist rabbis who were just arrested in New York City, but also Reform individuals. But Reform is so intent. It's like they've been having these podcasts about how do we get rid of the anti-Zionists in our midst. They're more concerned with policing reform than they are with the moral outrage that's presented before them, that they have to respond to. As Peter Baynard said, do the rabbis believe in God? Do they believe in the Ten Commandments? Do they believe in Deuteronomy, justice, justice, justice? I mean, how can they sit as as any kind of moral authority after what what is going on in Gaza happens? So this label of self-hating Jews now, I think, will soon, not so distant future, actually be retired completely.
Yes, well, we have to hope that there will be these progressive changes and reflection, but we need, of course, also action now with your friends, etc. Everybody I know, is doing what they can to communicate with their people in their community, and we need to do that in all of our faith communities. I mean, frankly, to be honest, and something I said even on the RBN stream is that I have a lot of criticisms of the North American Muslim community, that while there were maybe many people who do participate in political action, demonstrations, and so on, that you don't hear a lot officially from the mosques themselves, from those organizations. And that's something that I think is very important. People underestimate the power of official collective action, like making a statement. I saw, for example, and it got tons of views, is that the, what was it? It was in Nova Scotia, the, farmers markets, association, basically, of the farmers markets, said we're about providing food, and to see the starvation that's taking place in Gaza, it has to stop. And we put out an official declaration that we demand that humanitarian aid be allowed into Gaza, etc. Food is a right, etc. So everybody, wherever you are, in whatever organizations you participate in, whether it's a community group, whether it's a church or other religious institution, whether it's a workplace, there are opportunities to add, objectively speaking, to the political pressure, not just as individuals that may go out, may write, may call their, political, elected officials, or go out on a demonstration, or tweet and, try and, kind of on social media, circulate information and perspectives that show and demonstrate solidarity with Palestine. But there are collective ways. And I think that's unfortunately something that in the 40 years of neoliberalism, it always was a problem in the United States anyway, at this sort of, apogee of capitalism, this individualizing of the way people kind of think about themselves and the world is, of course, very disabling. And any moment and any opportunity that we have where we can collectively have these discussions, come together, make a decision to affirm humanity, affirm the values that we have, and make a public commitment, is a positive step. It puts pressure. It makes it normal for people to express these feelings, in these different contexts. And if we only do it when we're privately in front of our computer screens, watching office hours and participating in the chat, where we feel free because we're together with our group and our community, we're not really taking advantage of the political opportunities that surround us to make a difference. So I just want to, encourage everyone to really do that. It's very, important. And there are a lot of ways that you can do it. We were talking about them. In the, when this comes out as a, once the live stream is over, I will put into the description of this some of the links and resources to things that I've mentioned, that Dr. Salzman, has mentioned. But there was a previous from a while ago. What about the Catholic Church? They've been silent. And I think, again, this is a massive global institution that carries a certain amount of moral seriousness in certain quarters. Okay, we know there's a lot of problems with these institutions, and there was the, various scandals, and so on. But actually, and Francis wasn't great on those, let's admit it. Pope Francis wasn't great on the sex abuse scandal at all. But he was very good on some of these other issues. And I actually think that we are kind of lucky that a protege of his has come in, and they've made, the new Pope, Pope Leo, has made, kind of statements that suggest that he's continuing, in some sense, at least, the perspective of valuing human life in a consistent and universal way. But I do think, if you're a Catholic, the church is yours too. There are venues and opportunities.
At the parish level,
That's right, especially at those levels.
Yeah, I have friends, colleagues who work with their churches at the grassroots level to do human rights work within the church. The priests themselves are not preaching the important encyclicals that Pope Francis came out with on the environment,
Right.
but there are ways to do it. There are ways to bring in speakers into your churches. The Black churches did that in the United States.
Yes.
They invited Palestinian Christians to come worship with them. They signed a full-page ad in the New York Times. Hundreds of congregations signed that ad, protesting, demanding a ceasefire, end to war. And although individual actions may not succeed, or petition or whatever, there is a reason to try to get an opinion piece in to your local newspaper. People do read it. Get a letter in, and do everything you can, and realize that we really are in this pivotal moment, life or death, really.
Yeah, it really is.
And we have to mobilize offensively to force our elected leaders to do what they say they're going to do, and defensively to realize that we're going to be facing very strong headwinds over the next few weeks in particular.
Yes. I think that's very important to reemphasize something you mentioned earlier. Reemphasize there is going to be an all-out attempt to try and give themselves this full month. We have to counter that. But Ariel, I also want to recognize that you've been given a remarkable compliment in this community, saying you resemble Nora Barrows Friedman, who, of course, many of you know as one of the editors and one of the Electronic Intifada, and one of the hosts of the Electronic Intifada live stream, an indispensable resource, and also a former guest on the very first Struggle Session live stream panel on this channel, and will be coming back to the channel soon, I hope. So any rate, that's a great compliment.
I take it as a great compliment.
Yes, it is. So, okay, well, so I don't, what other things, I'm going to scroll and see what else, but, there are also, I did want to mention also the Accountability Archive. Okay, so at accountabilityarchive.org, there is an attempt to assemble material and information, statements that have been made, media, news reports, to assemble it for history, but also, so that people know now that they will not be able to evade accountability, because there is a massive global effort that we all can do whenever we see something on social media, in the mainstream media, etc. We can, kind of clip it, link it, and send it to accountabilityarchive.org. Okay, so they are a kind of activist grassroots effort to assemble all of this information, and they will work with other institutions to make sure it is available. But the point is, I'm a historian, Ariel's a historian. For us, I think this is very important, what's happening now, but also how we will write the history. And so much, and we did this series, basically an 8-part series, but particularly the first 6, 7 episodes were really about the longer and deeper history and context that Ariel, the approach that she's taken to reframing kind of these questions in her course, we wanted to share it with a wider audience because we think history and the way we narrate it and talk about it and conceptualize and imagine it is really important for our contemporary analysis of the world we've inherited and of the future we want. So
but also to account, to keep records, I would say maybe, and that's another thing we should think about is as a website or a place, a repository for the resistance.
Yes, yes.
And this is something that our dear friend Rabab Abdul Hadi has always reminded us, that we need archives and histories of resistance, the Palestinian resistance, of course, but also Palestinian allies. What we've been doing, and she was trying to document in the United States from the 1980s onward, Jewish resistance. She found it very important, and it's important because we are agents of history. We, are not just subjects of history; we're agents of history. But it's also necessary because we have to go back and think about strategy. What did we do? What worked? What didn't work? What can we do differently? And we have to count, and so assembling that information as well as analyzing it, the resistance, as we're in this period where technologies are changing radically, and where authoritarian is going to be shutting us down. And it's already shut down. Parts of the media is going after funding, etc. So we're going to have to adapt rapidly, but we have to know what we did well in the past and what how we can change and how we can adapt and be more effective in the future.
Absolutely. I think that's really the way to frame what's the value of history in these contexts for our active struggles for liberation and justice. And that's why we do these, on this channel, why we spend a lot of time talking about history, why we did the Palestine in the World kind of series, and also why I started Guerrilla History that I still co-host with Henry Hakamaki, is because this is a resource for us. And so much, let's be honest, so much of white supremacy, Eurocentrism, and all of this is based on a false but ideologically very significant vision of history to aggrandize Europe and Western civilization as the exclusive apex of human, value and achievement. And it's just so important to have a genuine knowledge and understanding of global history to value and recognize the humanity and the contributions to human culture as a whole from all parts of the human experience, all parts of the globe. And it's only really that way that we can actually, I think we have to have a reframing of our history of the world if we're to have an equitable, just future for the world. I mean, you can't have one without the other if you still maintain these false narratives of European, kind of uniqueness and exceptionalism, or the American exceptional kind of like narrative that it's this most unique and special and distinctive nation in the history of the world, which essentially authorizes it to violate basically the rights of all others, because when it does so, it's doing so, out of its own exceptional, unique genius on behalf, of the, that it's for the world somehow, So it's so important to have like a better sense of the global history. I know it's something that you do so much of, Ariel.
But it's also, we can tell because that's where Trump is going after. I mean, it's basically to eradicate from the Smithsonian Institute, it's DeSantis in Florida, shutting down, it's to shut down this whole area of knowledge of the collectivity, the global collectivity of understanding where we are today and how we got here, and what we share with everybody else. And so that has become the goal. I mean, it's one of the key features of the Trump administration is eradicating that sort of history commons, and bringing together, all peoples and recognizing their contributions. And also by the same token, of recognizing what we have lost by the oppression of other people, by the
Yes.
killing of other people. How many future Nobel peace, Nobel Prize winners in sciences and peace are dead now in Gaza? The brilliant minds that have been lost, a generation that has been systematically limited by, this 22 months of starvation, malnutrition, maiming, etc. So the world has to realize that there is a cost that is paid when we ignore and we deny the humanity of our fellows within our countries and, of course, abroad. So history brings that forward and corrects that narrow vision that likes to reinforce, of course, white supremacy, Eurocentrism, and especially in this moment when we're going to be facing ever greater crises with mass movements of people, given the massive changes in climate that are bearing down on us, of fires and floods and melting glaciers, and famine, that we have to realize there is no individual country solution, and that we have to restore this element of humanity, of common humanity, immediately. And so there's, anyway, a
Yeah.
whole other discussion about the International Court of Justice ruling on this very thing about
There
reparations
was.
for
Yeah.
climate, right?
Yes, that's
So
right.
I mean, I hate to put it in dollars and cents, but that's what you know climate activists, environmental economists are trying to show people. What it is costing, what it is going to cost. The balance sheet, and we're talking about reparations for climate and reparations for Palestine, reparations for the Palestinians as a people. That has to be globalized and realized, and every state that participates in what's going on, that supports it, that delays, is now responsible and should pay, the price in its authority, in politicians, but also in the whole reparation process.
Yes, and I mean, I think part of the reason to do it, of course, would be to provide some compensatory justice for healing, for moving forward, repairing the harm and damage that's been caused, whether it's by the enslavement of millions in the transatlantic slave trade and the plantation slave societies of the Western Hemisphere, whether it is
and indigenous peoples,
indigenous peoples and their
mass destruction,
dispossession.
genocide of indigenous
That's
people.
right. I mean, and all the other previous genocides, the Armenian genocide, of course, for the Holocaust, for
That's
what's happening.
the one that
That's the only one that really there
one,
has been like
yeah.
compensation, kind of genuinely, where the world was mobilized, and of course they gave them stolen property. They said, "Here, go take somebody else's country. We'll support you to do that."
That was the UN
Yeah, rather than like
reparation.
yeah, there should have been like part of Bavaria or something.
Yeah,
Like, what's
exactly.
wrong with a
Yeah,
demilitarized Bavaria as a kind of homeland? So at any rate, but of course that's getting off on the subject. But I think that other point that was very poignant, because it reminded me when you said about what the cost is. It's also it is that if you have a movement that mobilizes around restorative justice and reparations, that forces potentially a solution earlier, thinking, well, okay, we better like stop this genocide, or we better stop this kind of devastation of the planet, and try and make amends now before, the total becomes impossible, right? Like it's the threat also of that there will be a process that's credible, and that, it's better to kind of stop these destructive practices now and, actually give, justice to people. But when you mention just what the cost, like the human cost of the people who've been killed, the children whose futures and their contributions, that have been cut off and destroyed, not only for their own people, but, for others. I remember seeing an amazing young boy. He was like 11 or something like this, who, this video I had seen, who he had developed like all kinds of like really smart technical ways of, providing electricity and like, cleaning water and doing he had like this whole apparatus that he developed from like, destroyed, parts and pieces and things that he had put together, and I just thought this kid is an absolute genius. If he had like the opportunity, and who knows, I don't know what his fate has been. This was early on in the first wave of people who were made refugees, who are already the descendants of refugees in Gaza when they were pushed south after the initial invasions in northern part of Gaza, Beit Hanun and so on. And they were in these early kind of like tent, cities, and he had, kind of rigged up all these kinds of systems. And I thought, what a loss it will be for the world, if he is not given the opportunity to advance in his education and make contributions. I mean, he was clearly somebody who could develop low energy like solutions for like societies that have, that don't have access to all of the same infrastructure. I mean, it was brilliant. And so that's, I guess, what we're saying is that the human cost, not only of these wars, the human cost of colonialism, of like the US empire, of capitalism, it's so destructive. We think of it, even Marx, I have to say, I have some concern, that he saw it as a developmental process. It was horrible. It caused all kinds of like exploitation and misery, but it was like a developmental process in history out of which something good could come, kind of more equal, where the means of production is now shared and socialized. Okay, wonderful. But frankly, to be honest, there are other ways of developing. This is the most ecologically devastating, human immiserating kind of way of trying to advance to achieve certain kind of material goals. And it just seems to me there's so many better ways. And if only we could equip people with solutions, with futures, with hope, we could have a much better world. We don't have to go through all this devastation. Its costs are just so high.
Yeah.
Anyway, my rant, but Francis, it's great to welcome, colleague Francis Hasso, who's written a wonderful book. I have to invite you, Francis, to come on and talk about your work. A wonderful Palestinian scholar. Gazans are the best engineers, poets, artists, plumbers, writers, mechanics, teachers, psychologists, farmers. Everyone else is mediocre at best. Well, I don't know. I mean, but the point is that they're an inventive and wonderful people, and they've been denied. They're being denied a future. And we've been saying, Gaza and global futures, we don't have a global future collectively that's one of health, peace, and justice if we don't have Gaza, if we don't have Palestine as part of it. And that's, I think, what I would take from Francis's point about how inventive.
How many poets, how many journalists, how many professors have been lost, in the first 6 months, taking of, some of the most brilliant poets of the day have been killed, along with their families. So, and to have that, for these flowers to flourish, even, after 17 years of a siege, carving out, it was just an incredible, what the Gazans achieved, is just so incredible. And it is such a loss for the world, and it is the most cruelest um, attempt to, suppress uh, these flowers springing up out of the rubble. It's just horrible. Um, so yes, but
Yeah.
Jonas was talking about, what one can do, and educating oneself about,
Hmm.
what the stakes are, what's going on. Unfortunately, of course, the Silicon Valley is very much involved. Microsoft. There's been a new report by the Israeli investigative report. I think it's 972 with the Guardian that just came out on Microsoft basically hosting clouds of surveillance information, and I mean, uh, these revealing these kind of ways in which these mega corporations are working, especially the high tech sector, in facilitating the oppression, the occupation, and of course the genocide is also something that has to happen. We know that software engineers have come out and protested,
Yeah.
Google employees, Microsoft employees, and of course they've been fired. They've done it at great cost to themselves. But we have to know more information about this, and we have to document their crimes and their complicity in it. And I think Francesca Albanese's report has a list of many of those companies that are directly involved. Companies I didn't know about, Volvo, for example,
Hmm. Hmm.
is involved in destruction of Palestinian villages and homes, and equipment that's used. Korean Dosant and Hyundai are also involved in all of this.
Yes.
So yeah, so the tech sector, and the one thing that I think for me is happening, what I see in Gaza, and I see in the way that Gaza is being set out as an example, a cautionary tale for the world, right?
Yeah.
That this is the world's future. If you disobey, this will happen to you. Is this convergence of the authoritarians and, of course, the uber capitalists like the Trumps and the oligarchs with the tech sector? And their solution now to the climate crisis is a securitization of the world, and a securitization, a militarization of, instead of dealing with climate. They're just going to accept the environmental devastation and say, okay, we're going to build these enclaves. We're going to build, concentration camps in Africa, in the Everglades, and we're just going to confine people, displace people, and then build electronic and military barbed wire around them, and fortresses to, transport the rest of the world's resources to the very few, the fortunate few. So I think we should really see in Gaza the world's future,
Yes.
and start thinking along those lines too.
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is something that we talked about a little bit in the series, as well as looking at the tech kind of interface, the let's put it this way, the transhumanist kind of model of the future, which is either from this kind of supremacist sort of perspective, think of all these peoples of the global south and others as subhuman, less than human, and they can be, they are a potential problem. They have to be managed, and that's what we use this kind of tech surveillance, fortress, population control. But sometimes you might also just need to liquidate some of them, and you should be able to do so with impunity. Or there is this kind of like a sort of sense of a grand future for the few, of like living for 250 years and putting your consciousness
Yeah,
into some kind of matrix of biochemicals and electrodes or whatever in some computer network, and then thus living forever. And these kind of futuristic, transhumanistic, elite visions, whether it's the idea that, well, the world will be devastated and populated by restive people, so we'll just create,
Yeah, they're
some other world on Mars
exceptionalists,
or Elysium, like that
preppers.
movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you've got these kinds of visions. And in some sense, what we've been saying in the series and what we've been saying in the discussion today, and we've even talked a little bit about it at the last office hours, is that, there is a demonstration effect in Gaza where this model is being worked out, which is why we spend so much time talking about it. Of course, we also decry the devastation that's taking place with the UAE financed and supported and armed, genociders in the Sudan and all these other places. But in some sense, the world global process is being contested, resisted, and fought over right now in Gaza. This is like where we're seeing, as you were saying, a look in a window into a potential future, a future that we must, try and combat and avoid, for the sake of humanity.
And it's also a psychological, it's a deliberate attempt to achieve a psychological numbing.
That's right.
To what
That's
happens.
a good point.
To inure an entire
it's okay to
middle
do
class.
this genocide.
This happens,
It's yeah.
to these other people, and you have to deal with
You have
it
to accept
and
it.
Move on.
And if it happens somewhere else, that's just how these things work. Exactly. I think it's to normalize the idea. Putin called it the golden billion, right? Well, even the billion is too many ultimately for these people. They're going to contract from there as they will, impoverish and make irrelevant many surplus populations of, working class people in, in Europe and North America, in the West as well. I mean, this is a process that continues to go in a certain, direction. It's dangerous, for all, but the ideology of racism and all of what we had been talking about before, of not valuing other people's histories and thinking about of history as really culminating in the apogee of human culture and civilization in the West, and devaluing everything else is kind of the racist version of a kind of historical consciousness that authorizes this continuing process of privileging fewer and fewer people over the rest of over the rest of the world. So I think one thing, though, that I just as we're getting closer toward a kind of conclusion here, is that it is still kind of astonishing, however, that it seems that some of these people are willing, they either erect these walls of denial to not see and recognize and deal with reality, or they have made their sort of peace through these kinds of senses of justifying their privilege on whatever basis or terms that they're doing so, that so many people seem willing to countenance and allow this genocide to continue,
or
and
even use it as a way to create a new sense of
right.
Limited responsibility,
Yeah.
in this phrase toxic empathy, right, which a
Yes.
lot of the Christian right are adopting,
Yes.
as a way to anesthetize themselves.
That's right.
And to say that I can't feel for other people, this is
Mhm.
liberalism, and this is irrelevant, whether they go to heaven or don't, or go to
Yeah.
hell or starve, if they're not part of our in-group, our
That's
community,
right.
it doesn't matter. And that's the kind of evangelical fervor without the New Testament that is happening on the West Bank,
Mhm.
with these Israeli settlers. I mean, they're the literalism of the 5 books of Moses. The taking of Jericho, slaying every human being, right, and every animal within it, taking literally Amalek, and this, which is just astounding. It's not, it's another Judaism. It's
Yeah.
but I feel it's definitely influenced by the currents in fundamentalist religions all over the world, especially Christianity, and is being goaded on by it, and with the sense of mission, that, of course, Christian Zionists are giving to these settlers. And I wouldn't be surprised because the Israeli army is going to fall apart.
Yeah. Well,
And I
Gaza
wouldn't be
Humanitarian
surprised.
Foundation, they could step in.
Yeah, no, they're going to have mercenaries, but they're
These
also going to have
mercenaries.
Christian Zionist volunteers.
Yeah.
I mean, they have
Well, they're already there. They're being
yeah, they're already
paid, but
there.
there,
Yeah,
there are possibility, as you're saying, of
yeah,
volunteers who are ready to help create the conditions for the rapture, or
yeah,
something like
yeah,
this. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, this is the kind of situation, of course, that we're, facing. And I just, I did quote at the end of last office hours, because we came to a similar kind of point, the Gustavo Petro's speech, where he said, look, this is what's happening in Gaza is what the ultra rich plan for the rest of us, basically. But, he also made his appeal and said, well, that's how history has gone, is that we've had to resist. We've had to, fight this kind of barbarism and to fight for a world in which, we can make love and humanity, more possible. And I mean, I think it's wonderful to have at least one kind of leader actually articulating a positive vision of a possible world. I mean, really, this is one of the things that I've been a little bit kind of disappointed about, all those who are very interested in the Russia-China axis, multipolarity. They're fighting the US empire. It's well, yes, they are developing their own kind of great power kind of conditions and doing, things for their people and their economy. And look, how many people have been moved over the course of a half century from, poverty to a reasonable and dignified standard of living in China, et cetera. But, this is no longer the Bandung era. This is no longer, the kind of, and I think we actually need another Bandung. And I was hoping in some ways that the Hague
the Hague
group
group
might
would
sort of
morph into
develop, some kind of sense of that. In fact, I will be having actually a conversation. I want to announce it here with the aforementioned Rabab Abdul Hadi, a dear friend and colleague of both mine and Dr. Ariel Salzman, along with a couple other guests, including Salman Sayed from University of Leeds, to talk about the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. I mean, it happened earlier in the year. The anniversary was actually in April, but it is the 70th year. And I think it's an important moment to look back on to say, what were the possible different paths, that were available, why we're in a similar kind of moment in some ways, but of course there are many different conditions that are militating against the possibility of some collective project, some sort of other way between these different states of the kind of global South. And in some sense, I think the weakness of the Bandung project of Afro-Asian, the Afro-Asian Conference, was that it was just states rather than peoples of the kind of global South, also kind of mobilized together, in that. But I think one weakness of the current environment is that you have very few kind of leaders who are articulating some alternative vision for the world. And so I appreciated so much from Gustavo Petro, at least saying there are other ways. And I mean, he called out capitalism and said, capitalism is this they tell you these stories. It's like ghost stories, and we're living with these ghosts. They want us to believe in ghost stories. It's phantoms. I think maybe he had in mind, Marx's line about that there's a specter haunting Europe, from the Communist Manifesto. But this idea that, we've been sold a kind of false vision of how the world economy and the world geopolitical, organization needs to be. And it's a fanciful story that serves the interests of the few, and in this case, as he was saying, the ultra rich. And we have to stop believing these stories. And so, I mean, we could use more people collaborating, with a kind of vision like he's articulated. And it has been somewhat disappointing on two levels. One, to see, kind of countries that could do more being too afraid to sacrifice maybe some short-term interests economically, or make themselves, objects of, this erratic Trump, kind of like bullying, just to avoid it. And also those countries that I'm most kind of frustrated with, of course, are the disgusting, co-opted, corrupt compradors of the region who have shown no solidarity with the people of Palestine and have taken no genuine action, but in fact actually have collaborated with a greater Israel vision.
But this goes so far back. Iqbal Ahmed wrote an op-ed piece years ago, condemning Saudi Arabia and
the reactionary regimes,
for what was happening in Palestine, completely. But I think the only good that's going to come out of this moment in global politics with Trump is laying bare the flaws and the contradictions in existing multilateral and national. And we have to highlight those things and think, are these structures salvageable?
Right.
Is the UN salvageable with this, basically, the kings on top in the Security Council, being, directing everything. It's a, sort of collective, group of plutocrats ruling the world, and then just letting the rest of the world sort of hash it out in the General Assembly, subverting international law. And a lot of like Mukhaiber, who's left, who resigned, people
Craig
resigned in
Mukhaiber,
protest. What are we going to be talking about with international law? What are the institutions, and the Democratic Party in the United States, or the Liberal Party, after Carney, what's going to be left of the Liberal Party, and where is Canada going to go after that? When we see the bankruptcy of, where the Liberal Party has gone and where the Democratic Party, I mean, the greatest obstacle, against to mobilizing against Trump is actually the Democratic Party now in the United States, because it's suppressing all the great candidates and the young people who are coming forward. And
we're dealing with a kind of embedded, calcified gerontocracy that will not give up on the world that they have destroyed. I mean, totally sclerotic. I mean, so that's indeed the situation. As we're winding down in the last, few minutes, I first, have to say, everybody, please, before you go, like the stream so that, the afterlife of the live stream, the video on YouTube, will come to the attention of others. I think there's been a, fruitful and important and interesting kind of conversation with analysis that sometimes can be very gloomy and dismal, but also we've tried to talk a little bit about our hopes for, a different world and some of the mechanisms we need to use right now at this moment to have a politics of accountability, to put political pressure to end this genocide, and to put forward our own vision of a better future for not only Gaza, Palestine, but the world as a whole. And so I want to thank Ariel so much for participating in not only this live stream and the discussion, but in 8 episodes where you will be absolutely educated by her brilliant analysis of the history, the reframing of Israel and Palestine, of the kind of sources of the disappointments of emancipation, the emergence of nationalism around the Mediterranean world, in Europe, etc. It's really important that we be educated. So go back and check out Palestine and the World, History in a Time of Genocide, Denial. There's 8 episodes. You will get a real serious education there. And so, Ariel, I want to thank you for all of the work you've been doing.
Organizing this and working with it and the audience. And I really hope to get feedback, because I think, if we get more feedback on that series, on this, we know where to go. We know what questions we should be answering. And I hope that, that the gloom and doom that we're experiencing now is not paralyzing. We can't let it. We are in a fateful moment in historical time, and it's time to mobilize and think anew of what can be done and how we're going to achieve it. Divestment, and holding accountable those participants in the genocide, including our own institutions and our countries.
Absolutely. Well, we've been receiving a lot of positive feedback in the comments, but as Ariel says, go listen to the series and let us know what you thought was important, interesting, revealing, and exactly as she said, we're going to continue to be doing things. When talking about history, about the current, about the future, what we can do. I'm going to be putting in some links for some of the organizations that you can support that I mentioned that seem to be doing important and serious work in trying to hold the war criminals accountable, and to do so in a way that leverages political pressure now to put an end to the genocide. Those will be there. I just want to have a shout out to Palestine Action. There's a judicial review that's taking place in order to remove see whether they should be removed. And I think there's going to be a very strong legal case for it, whether they should be removed from the proscribed list of organizations. It's clearly just an attempt to stop one of the most effective ways of dramatizing how complicit all of our kind of economies are in sustaining a genocide taking place in Gaza, in Palestine, and they want to put a stop to it. And so we hail what they've been doing, and we support and hope that they will be able to return to direct action. Just want to remind people of the Freedom Flotilla. There's a new effort for an expanded flotilla to break the siege of Gaza and have a massive flood of ships. There's going to be many ships this time being organized, and I believe that there are 6,000 volunteers. Go check out, and there's a bunch of different flotilla organizations that are collaborating together on it. One of the ones I can mention is the Freedom Flotilla that did the Handala, and previously the earlier one. Go check out what they're doing, support their work. And, just there's BDS everywhere, as I said, in whatever venue you can get a collective decision together to make a statement publicly about your desire to have an arms embargo, to stop the genocide, and to support Palestinian rights. It is a win, and it's an important win. You, of course, can all be abiding by the boycott in your own lives. There's many resources. Go check out the BDS website. And also, let's just put pressure on our own governments. They're teetering, they're under pressure. They're trying to kind of derail and obfuscate, and in many cases lie about the complicity. We must hold them accountable. They must know that we will hold them accountable. Let's go forward and put an end to this. We're not waiting until September 9th. We got to put a stop to it now. So I want to thank everybody for coming here. Like the stream, share the video, subscribe to the channel. If you can support the project, you can go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain and help defray some of the costs of doing this. But no matter what, the more important thing is share this with others who you think might be inspired to benefit from the knowledge and also be inspired to action. That's what we hold these office hours for, and why we did the series. So again, I want to wish you all peace and solidarity, and we'll see you again next week for office hours with Adnan Husain. We'll see you soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.